I thought I'd kick off, because essentially the series is my fault in one way or another. I need to justify it in various ways. I thought one good way of talking about it might be to talk about a classic, one of the great Central European classics, which alas can never really be republished, which is one of my proudest possessions. And this is Baedeker's Guide to Austria-Hungary in the 1911 edition, which was, I think, the last English edition of this extraordinary book. Before, in one of the more minor problems of the 20th century, its staff found themselves without a job. On almost every page it has something which is unintentionally shocking. It's meant to be a cheerful book, but really it's not a cheerful book at all. And has very oddities, like, for example, if you just look at the entry on Krakow, for example, it refers to it as Krakow, and it says, formerly the capital of Poland, now an Austrian fortress of the first class, with a population of 150,000, brackets, 80,000 Poles, 25,000 Jews, and 5,000 Germans, including a garrison of 10,000 men. And in 1911, of course, that meant almost nothing, and of course, since then, there's virtually nothing about that which isn't redolent of all kinds of terrible things.
When I first picked this book up, I got very impatient with it. I thought, I wasn't sure what it was supposed to be. I wasn't sure whether it was supposed to be a memoir, or whether it was a case of kind of a rewriting of Baron Munchausen by other means. So Baron Munchausen meeting Nabokov or something like that. It's written with a proper poetic power, with some extraordinary images. I'll give you a couple of these images in a second. But it's written in a manner which is kind of puffed up, but in a very entertaining sort of way. In my student days, he says, Eva had been a famous actress in Vienna. Although I was only an unknown student, she remained faithful to me for years. If after the show was over, she noticed me standing on the other side of the Josefstadter Strasse under the gas lamp, she would leave a world-famous director without saying goodbye and run across the road between automobiles and streetcars to join me. At such time, Max Reinhardt gazed after her with a melancholy expression. So you can see, I mean, he has a clear idea of his role in life.
I didn't understand, first off, what Thomas Bernhard, an Austrian, is doing on such a list. He was born in Holland. He wrote in German, still a big language compared to some of the others, a regional superpower of a language. He wintered in Mallorca. He bought and restored old properties in beautiful parts of Austria. He wanted at one time to be set up by his publisher in a suite in the Plaza Hotel on Central Park, New York, for a few months, where by way of saying thank you, he would write a novel. It never happened, but these are not perspectives accorded to your Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, etc. So why Bernhard? Then I started to see it. Bernhard is that odd thing, your Western dissident author. He is an anti-state writer, even though his state, though corrupt, banal, and without flair, was at least democratic, Western, and neutral. He is like Oscar Wilde with invective in lieu of wit, and less room for self-doubt. Speaking of Herbert's poem, The Power of Taste, the argument basically that good taste is what kept him from ever taking communism seriously, is recast in Bernhard to allowing one painting, and not that. One Mahler composition, and not that. One hotel, and not that. One friend, one wife, one occupation, and not them. A kind of insatiable prissiness and exactingness that nothing, and least of all the state, was able to satisfy. Vienna is quite superficially famous for its opera, but in fact it is feared and detested for its scandalous lavatories. The Viennese and the Austrians generally have no lavatory culture. Nowhere in the world would you find such filthy and smelly lavatories, Reger said. To have to go to the lavatory in Vienna is usually a disaster. Unless you are an acrobat, you get yourself filthy, and the stench there is such that it clings to your clothes, often for weeks. The Viennese are altogether dirty, Reger said. There are no city dwellers in Europe who are dirtier, just as it is a well-known fact that the dirtiest flats in Europe are the Viennese flats. The Viennese flats are even dirtier, a lot dirtier, than the Viennese lavatories. The Viennese keep saying everything is so dirty in the Balkans. You hear this kind of talk everywhere, but Vienna is 100 times dirtier than the Balkans, Reger said.
I should have read it when I was like in my late teens, so this book wasn't available because it was on blacklist, and together with books of Kundera or Hrabal and all other writers. Now the book sets in this small city Náchod, which is about 200 kilometers north of Prague, and with the main heroes is Dany Smiřický, which is kind of alter ego of Josef Škvorecký. And now everybody knew that they have to do something, because if they don't, so the uprising in Prague would happen, really would be disaster. Now the problem is that partly the people were partly disorganized, partly they didn't know what to do, and they were not willing really to make many sacrifices. So the title of the book, Cowards, actually it points towards that. Now interesting thing about this book is that Josef Škvorecký writes it in a very different way. Like, it is not heroic story. It's written by this young guy who is in love with his sweetheart, but she loves someone else. And most of the book he moans about her. And when the idea of uprising comes up, so he thinks, well, that would be good, because she could remember me. I could really perform some kind of heroic deed.
I would think food forms 25% of the book. I mean, people quarrel about it, people argue about it, people sit around eating almost forever. And food is a kind of displaced activity of something else. On one level, it's a kind of erotic displacement. On another, it's a kind of nostalgic, idealistic kind of displacement. At the center, there are two stories. There is a Sindbad story in here, which is rather fascinating, in which Sindbad is a character who's at least 300 years old, and some of the time he's dead, and some of the time he's alive, but it doesn't make any difference whether he's dead or alive, because he carries on acting. And he carries on acting in people's imaginations. That's what happens here. There's a passage, one of the stories here, it's called The Waiter's Nightmare. And the waiter's nightmare consists of a man who just eats. He just comes in and eats and eats and eats, course after course after course, every time describing how it would be best cooked, whatever he is, whatever he's eating. It would be best done like this, and you must understand me that if you prepare it this way and if you prepare it that way, that seems to be the kind of core of it. What you get with Crudy all the time is there's nothing important happens in it. People die, people fight duels, people are killed, but no major political events. The First World War doesn't turn up. There was an English writer called Anthony Hope who wrote a book called The Prisoner of Zenda. And in some ways, Crudy reminds me of an infinitely superior Prisoner of Zenda. Insofar it's a kind of Ruritania, but without the royal family. A Ruritania without the centres of power. Everything in Crudy is peripheral. Nothing matters. That's why the food matters. That's why the erotic experience matters. Meanwhile, the guest, after the requisite dip in gravy, was shoveling slices of duck thigh into his mouth as into some storehouse, and he seemed especially gladdened by the sight of pieces of skin showing a soft layer of fat. This stowing away proceeded at an accelerated pace, with only a tentative stab or two towards the red cabbage before the eater made up his mind to balance a small heap of cabbage on his knife blade and shoveled that too into his maw. The cabbage proved to be crunchy. "We'll have to chastise the cook because she did not marinate the cabbage long enough," said the guest, with a certain severity of tone to Fridolin, the waiter, who in the manner of old-time waiters was fascinated by each mouthful of food that disappeared into his customer's mouth. "Maybe you'd like a little gravy on the cabbage," the waiter ventured. And this is quite a few pages of this.
I was wondering if this great European literature draws on classical English literature at all, or refers to Shakespeare, Dickens, and all the great poets of our language. Do they still refer to it? Is it still relevant or important to them?
There are direct references to Shakespeare, to Byron. I mean, one of translation into Hungarian, I used to think of it as a major branch of heavy industry coming into Hungary, and they translate everyone. And I think the idea, you go back to the notion of the provinciality, and Hungary has a sense of its own provinciality, a small country with a small language. It wants to draw in. So English literature, I don't mean contemporary English literature so much, I don't think so, but what you might think of as classical English literature, romantic literature certainly, and then Anglo-Irish literature like Swift, I think are very powerful in the Hungarian literary consciousness.
I had a feeling when I was read the Coward, Skorecki's book, and maybe other Skorecki books as well, that American is important to him.
Yes. Holden Caulfield elsewhere.
Skorecki studied English, and he was influenced by American writers. But from the general viewpoint, I think the Byron is the kind of like almost the most important, especially in Czech national enlightenment. So Byron is kind of like major inspiration. And knowledge of Shakespeare, Josef Cajetan Tel, the Czech enlightenment writer, who everyone has at school. So he was an actor and playwright, and they knew Shakespeare, although through German translations, I have to say.
Do you think that the modern generation can actually understand, unless they know their history? Can they understand what's going on in what is either Central Europe or East Europe or whatever? It is incredibly complicated history.
George, do you have a view on that?
Well, through reading such books, I mean, my impression is that educated young Hungarians are extremely conscious of their history, and their history is constantly brought to bear, partly through their parents, partly through modern contemporary political conditions, in which the political tension between, on the one hand, at some point Hungary and Romania, then Hungary and Slovakia, or as it may be Hungary and Serbia at some point. Central Europe is full of pockets of people who have lived in the same place but different places, because the maps have changed around them. I think that works its way deep into the neural system, and I think that history is internalized to a great extent.
But is it fair to say that Britain has never at any point really understood Central Europe? Is that
it really should be able. I mean, I don't understand why not really. I mean, in the sort of, following the East of Aden and loss of empire and now devolution. I mean, this is a country that's lost its arms and legs and still doesn't know what's happening to it. And I think these things are so precisely and delicately and ironically understood by these Eastern European writers that I think it's the best way for England to find out what's happening to it and why it doesn't feel good. Is read these people. I mean, there's a little sentence in the Skwareczki book, which I kind of belatedly read for the first time. I'd read other books of his, where there's the bourgeois general of this belated Czech resistance, and Danny takes in what's on his desk. 4 paper flags, Czechoslovak, Soviet, American, and British, stood on his desk in a little vase. There was no water in it. I think